Huge apologies for everyone attending for the technical glitch. I'm glad to see that you are receiving the emails and you've made it here. So just want to welcome you to today's PTRC Fireside Chat. I'll give you a quick introduction to PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK, which specialises in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers and placemakers. We also run a conference every year called the Transport Practitioners Meeting, in which delegate places are and now available to book. At some point throughout your discussion, I will put information on that into the chat. PTRC is part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organisation for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April 2020, we've had some amazing and insightful conversation during these fireside chats, and looking forward to today's talk on triple access planning. Please feel free to use the chat function to ask your panel any questions that you may have. And yeah, hope you enjoy today. And I'll hand over to Ben now, who will be your chair for the discussion.
Shania, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's lunchtime webinar. And again, apologies for the slight technical glitch at the start of the call. My name is Ben Plowden. I'm chair of the Transport Planning Society, which Stephen Cragg, who's one of our panelists, suggested we should change to the Triple Access Planning Society, not least after today's event. So we'll have to give that some serious consideration. Triple access planning, which is the subject of today's webinar, I think is one of the most important developments in thinking about transport and how we approach it of the last 15, 20 years. And in fact, as Glenn, I'm sure will say in a minute, that it's a piece of work that's been in development for about a decade. This is a sort of 10th anniversary of Glenn's initial work on it. And we've got a very distinguished panel with us today who I'll introduce in a minute to talk about this subject. But I think triple access planning genuinely represents a paradigm shift in the way that we talk and think and plan for transport, moving from a transport planning approach based on predict and provide, which has been the traditional approach, to a more decide and provide approach, which is the one suggested by the triple access planning process. Moving from a narrow mobility focused approach to transport and how we think about it and plan for it, to a much more systemic and holistic approach, an access-based approach to transport planning and policy. But it also raises some very important questions. What is triple access planning? How do we implement it? What are the politics and procedural challenges around using this new approach to thinking about transport and how it develops over the long term? And those, I think, are some of the questions we're going to address during the course of the next hour and a half or so. So as I say, to help us explore this topic, we've got a very distinguished panel who I'll now introduce. We have Glenn Lyons, who's the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of West England in Bristol. We have Rose MacArthur, who's Director of Transport and Highways for Cheshire West and Chester Council. Stephen Cragg, who's Head of Appraisal and Model Development at Transport Scotland. Annette Smith, Head of Future Mobility at Mott MacDonald. And lastly, but not leastly, Deborah Payton, Head of Transport Planning Delivery for Glasgow City Council. So as you can see, we've got a very broad range of experience, both from academia, consulting, and both national and local government. And I'm sure that will be exactly what we need to get us on our way. So what's going to happen is I'm going to ask each speaker, each panelist to introduce themselves briefly and say 3 or 4 minutes worth of thoughts on insights, questions, challenges that they think triple access planning raises for them, both in principle and of course in practice. I'll ask some questions as we go along just to kind of help stimulate the debate, and then there'll be a chance for questions to go into the Q&A or the chat on the call from all of you, and I'll put those to the panelists as appropriate. And then I'll end by asking the panelists to just reflect briefly on what they've heard during the course, or what they've said during the course of the webinar. My aim is to finish by just before 2 o'clock because a couple of us have to then join other meetings at 2, but hopefully we'll get through lots of stuff in that period. And just one final plug from me, by happy coincidence or perhaps brilliant planning, this evening we have another webinar on this topic, which involves Will Pedley from Oxfordshire County Council, who was the TPS Transport Planner of the Year for 2023. And he's going to be talking this evening about the practicalities of decide and provide in a county council, which is, if you like, triple access planning in practice. So without further ado, let me start by asking Glenn to introduce the idea of triple access planning, which is, after all, your brainchild. What is it? Why is it important? And how should we put it into practice? Glenn.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And great to see everyone here. And well done, Shania, I guess we need to think about adaptive planning as well, since the world keeps throwing us uncertainties that we've just experienced today. So yes, I thought I'd focus my opening remarks on where the idea came from, what it is if you're not familiar with it, and why it matters. Well, triple access planning, as Ben said, has been at least a 10-year journey for me. Back in 2014, I led some work within the New Zealand Ministry of Transport that was considering future uncertainty and demand for car use. There was no sign of a pandemic back then, but there were clear signs that the digital age was affecting transport. We conceived of the notion of what we called the triple access system, which you can see just making out behind me, I hope. It's the world we live in. In going about our personal and working lives, we rely to varying extents on what we need or want to access being within reach, by jumping in a car or on public transport, or by it being close by, or by it being accessible online. In other words, we rely upon a combined offering from the transport system, land use system, and telecommunications system. It follows that if as planners we want to contribute to stewardship over the future, then we need to consider the system we're trying to shape. If we only consider the transport system as transport planners, then we're being ignorant, and we're inviting, frankly, uncertainty into decision-making simply by ignoring the other two systems. The work in New Zealand also set out an alternative paradigm to predict and provide that's well known in transport planning, and as Ben said, called it decide and provide. In short, it can be said then that instead of transport planning in the paradigm of predict and provide, we were and are advocating a new way forward, triple access planning in the paradigm of decide and provide. Triple access planning is vision-led, not forecast-led. It points to supply-led demand instead of demand-led supply. It's access-focused, not mobility-focused, and it accommodates rather than conceals uncertainty. I spent the last 10 years encouraging the approach and helping support its introduction into planning practice, and I've certainly not been alone. A growing band of innovators has emerged. Recent developments have underlined the credentials, I think, in theory at least, for triple access planning being the way forward. The COVID-19 pandemic, in an unprecedented way, exposed politicians, professionals, and the public globally to the importance of the triple access system. The triple access system proved resilient in offering continuity of access for many. Society continued to function. The pandemic also reminded us of the incredible capacity of humans to adapt. Supply of access changed, notably with restrictions on using the transport system, and demand adapted as a consequence. Behaviours changed. The pandemic also propelled us, of course, further into making use of digital connectivity to support our economic and social activities. I don't know about you, but now more than ever, when I'm occasionally in my car driving in traffic for work, especially since it's knowledge work, I can't quite believe how archaic it seems to see all these boxes of metal on wheels creating emissions to move human brains from one place to another to exchange information. It's quite remarkable that while digital accessibility is omnipresent, it's everywhere in society, it's also almost nowhere and invisible in transport planning. Alongside the pandemic is the climate emergency. This has led to a succession of governments around the world, nationally and locally, drawing up commitments that represent decide and provide, or at least the decide part. They're setting goals for decarbonisation and in turn trying to determine how to provide a way of getting there. Over the last 10 years, it's been very encouraging to see decide and provide in triple access planning being recognised and adopted by several transport and planning authorities. And I'd consider this to be a diffusion of innovation. It starts with the innovators, then moves on to the early adopters, before the early and the late majorities join, lastly joined by the laggards. It's not a revolution in transport planning, but it is a very important evolution. So to close, I'd say that triple access planning needs us first of all to pause, reflect, and open our minds with a willingness to unthink and rethink the way we approach planning. As Stephen would say, we need to get philosophical. Triple access planning is not offering up an easier alternative to transport planning, but I would strongly suggest it is more fit for purpose for the times we're living in. Thanks, Ben.
Ben, thank you very much. So it's evolutionary, not revolutionary. It's vision-led. It's supply-led demand, not demand-led supply. It's about access, not mobility. Just a quick question for me. In what way and to what extent does triple access planning have a kind of policy intent? Is it about reducing, for example, car mileage? Is it about achieving mode shift? Or is it not so much a policy phenomenon as a process and an analytical process? Has it got a policy intent or not really?
First and foremost, it's a policy-making process or a planning process, or an evolution of the process that we already operate in different parts of the world. Nevertheless, I suppose there are signals that we, perhaps many of us as professionals, are expecting to see policy and practice change in light of the circumstances we're facing. And if therefore one's saying, how do we respond to the climate emergency? If that points towards a need for behaviour changes and ways that we might change the systems we live our lives in, then in that sense, it lends itself, I suppose, more flexibly to different types of policies and ambitions being brought forwards. But yes, first and foremost, it's a planning process.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, without further ado, and Glenn will come back to you no doubt in a minute for questions and further discussion. Let's move on to Annette from Mott MacDonald. Annette, from a sort of consulting point of view, when you're advising clients, whether public or private sector, how and to what extent do you use triple access planning, and what are your thoughts on its potential value as a new way of approaching transport?
Yeah, so I'll just do an introduction and then I'll get onto the kind of work that we've been doing, but we've seen like a significant increase in local authorities, regional authorities really picking up triple access planning. And we're seeing that coming through in the briefs that are being issued, and particularly around local transport plans as well. So I'll share a bit more about that now. But yeah, hi everyone, I'm Annette Smith and I've been a transport planner for the last 25 years. I was a geography graduate in 1997 and I loved sustainability and all things human geography. So I started my career at the Transport Research Laboratory working on sustainable transport, and in particular focusing on how the integration of land use and transport planning could support sustainability. And back then, like in the late 90s and early 2000s, I worked on a European research project called Transland, and a UK research project called Distillate, which did stand for something, but I can't quite remember what it did stand for, but it was something to do with decision making in transport and land use integration. And so for me, this concept of achieving accessibility through different means, whether that's spatial or through the land use system, or physical through the transport system, isn't new. But obviously what is new in terms of triple access planning is the addition of digital on top of transport and land use. And this is an important dimension, but we haven't cracked land use and transport integration yet. So adding in digital is definitely a further challenge that we need to address. And what else I think is new and worth discussion today is our increasing ability to access and use data to bring triple access planning to life through visualization and mapping, and then to bring in our other honed skills that we've learned over the last couple of decades in transport planning, such as travel behavior change techniques, so that we're bringing an understanding of people and place into the challenges we want to resolve. So that kind of brings me, I guess, up to what I'm doing today, which is I lead our future mobility team at Mott MacDonald. And I'm actually not a massive fan of future mobility as a title, because I think future mobility is just excellent transport planning. But I focus on emerging modes and techniques to make transport planning as good as it can be. And one of the tools and lenses that I use in projects is triple access planning. And I've been part of the EU triple access planning project for uncertainty. And I guess picking up on your point, Ben, I guess that, most recently I've worked with TfWM on their LTP5, and we created what we call the TAP map, which maps triple access and then overlays that with car ownership and car use. And that ability to map data brings TAP to life and increases understanding of a place and provides decision makers with evidence of where they can kind of target their perhaps limited investment that they have. And it also kind of highlights kind of issues about accessibility and social equity. And I think that's a really important kind of aspect that we're kind of need to grapple with. I guess one final thing I want to say is that through TFWM's TAP map, we identified 4 different types of places across the West Midlands. And what we did find is that just because people have high levels of accessibility through triple access, it doesn't mean they necessarily gave up on their cars. But in the future, it might mean that perhaps we can persuade them to give up on their cars if they've got good accessibility already. And so finally, I'd just encourage you to play around and be creative with TAP and see where it takes you. And also think about how we can maximize TAP to realize the outcomes we want to achieve. So I'll leave it there, but it's great to be with you all today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Just again, a quick question for me. So you've talked about sort of using this for a client, TFWM. How and in what way are they, or are you sort of engaging with end users? You mentioned communities in West Midlands, sort of explain what this means and how it might be beneficial actually in the long run. What's that kind of conversation like?
Yeah, so I know TFWM are kind of using it to engage with the public, but what they've also got with TFWM and what we've got as well across the country now from DFT are these kind of personas. And I think that's really important for us to be able to think about the types of people that we're speaking to, and also, what their kind of mobility kind of types are, so that we can have really kind of targeted and I guess the most effective conversations with people. But I think it's really important to actually try and use this tool to be able to communicate how people can have more sustainable lifestyles.
Great.
And so
thank you very much. Okay. Let's move on to Rose MacArthur from Cheshire West and Chester Council. Rose, you've both consulted and now, if you like, are on the client side. How are you using this, and how did you come to this in terms of your professional career?
Great, thanks, Ben. I won't sort of go too far back into my sort of career history. I'll actually just start with that question, if you don't mind. So you're absolutely right. I'm the Director of Transport and Highways and now Climate Change in Cheshire West and Chester Council. We're a unitary, we're non-devolved, and both of those are really quite important for the context, I think, of the conversation today. I sit within the Places Directorate, which is the wider sort of cross-directorate area, which includes transport, it includes land use, it includes planning, it includes digital. So actually, I'm in this sort of really perfect place to be able to have really strong conversations with regards to triple access planning and its outcomes. Within my sort of own domain at the moment, I've got responsibility for strategic transport, transport commissioning, development control, highways, fleet, trees, flooding, climate change adaptation. There's a lot that I, within the directorate, needs to be able to kind of, and why triple access planning is so important kind of comes from what I look after, which is an absolute broad church, but I benefit massively, and everyone who lives, works and plays in Cheshire West and Chester benefits massively for me being able to grapple with and bring in all of the brilliant stuff that Glenn explained behind the triple access planning ethos. But what I want to kind of bring into this conversation actually is that this isn't just about transport and connectivity as those kind of main themes. If I told you every pound of council tax you spend, 70 pence of that pound goes on to treating the adults and children's social care crisis that we're in. So 70 pence of every pound goes on adults and children's social care, which leaves 30 pence for bin collection, waste, hedgerows, climate change, transport, potholes, defects. Everything else that your council does has a third sort of share. So actually there isn't a future for local authorities that doesn't take a one council approach. There isn't a future for local authorities that isn't trying to tackle the much bigger issues in society that we've got, because otherwise that 30 pence will shrink. Now, transport and connectivity for me sit at the heart of what those solutions are. They really, really do underpin, that connectivity really, really underpins what we're all trying to do from a triple access planning perspective, because it fosters a collaborative approach. TAP acts as this decision wheel for me to help have the conversations in a really healthy and constructive way about what we're doing. TAP helps me break down the silos between, and the mentality of silo working that you can often find within local authorities. It really doesn't foster that sort of brilliant holistic approach. And I just want to use an example, if I may, Ben, and maybe, if you want to come on to it later as to why I'm using this one, but our housing crisis, so social housing crisis. So we have a lot of people presenting as homeless. We have a lot of people who are become homeless for many different reasons. We have people on the edge of homelessness. And what we want to do is provide brilliant homes in the right place with access to the best services that are connected to the people that they need to be with access to education, healthcare, social cohesion and all of that. Now, for me, if we can, take that as a wicked issue and look collaboratively across the council, that's exactly what we should be doing. And again, this connectivity piece is crucial so that they have that stable place which is connected to all the places that they need to have access to. And that is a transport issue, it's a connectivity issue. And so it's absolutely fundamental for me anyway, within the position I've got, that we stay output focused and we stay centred on that sort of connectivity, the right people with access to the right places, and absolutely net zero and absolutely decarbonisation and absolutely sustainability. But for me, the angle I've sort of come at today from and what, Glenn and I and others talk about quite a lot is actually how do we use this as a broker, as a kind of a place to have that conversation where we say how land use planning plays perfectly into solving lots of other things, and then transport. So transport isn't a thing. Transport is absolutely centred on the outcome. So that's sort of me for today, really. Thanks, Ben.
Brilliant. So I think everybody, I'm assuming that most people in this call would agree that that this approach sits at the heart of all those other issues. I'm just wondering, Rose, how when you talk to your colleagues in housing or education or social services or planning, how helpful is triple access planning to unlock those sorts of one council approaches, or do they just think, well, it's a transport thing, I don't really deal with that? How does that go? How does that conversation go?
Yeah, but that's why the model is so helpful in the way that it's set out, and it's the way I use it, its application. So I talk about that term decision wheel. So you can make a decision based on a fiscal outcome, you can make a decision based on a social care outcome, you can make a decision based on any of those metrics, and it's just about sort of where you're turning that. So using triple access planning to actually sort of not counter, but to have a really healthy conversation to say, okay, that's great. If you put those homes there, that satisfies X, Y, and Z, but actually turn the decision wheel that way, and we'll look at it from a, accessibility instead of mobility here. That's a really disaggregately difficult effect. That's going to have a really detrimental impact on the ability, the availability of one bedroom housing stock that we desperately need to look from a social care perspective. So actually, it just allows me to have a very, very open, respectful, and challenging conversation with people who might be looking at that as their main agenda. So it's non-confrontational. It looks to get the best outcome of everything, and then it starts to see what we can do to get those absolutely whole sort of suite of better outcomes. So for me, it is like a bit like that decision wheel conversation where you can actually change the lens to start having those really progressive conversations about what else you can get from this process.
Great, brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to explore much of that in a minute. So Deborah Payton from Glasgow City Council, obviously you're working in a kind of pretty urban environment. Tell us a bit about your background and how you've been applying this approach in your work in Glasgow.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Deborah Payton. I'm Head of Transport Planning and Delivery at Glasgow City Council. So I oversee teams responsible for right from the beginning in terms of policy and strategy through business case to design and then the delivery of sustainable transport infrastructure. I suppose like Annette, I have nearly 25 years now of professional transport planning experience, although I did start as an urban planner and that's my postgraduate training. So perhaps this helps with this topic. So I really welcome triple access planning. We've tried to apply principles of it to the Glasgow transport strategy. And we now have a full Glasgow transport strategy in terms of a policy framework and then a spatial delivery framework. And we will be also working on a delivery plan later this year, but you can find information on that on our website. But some of the principles we've applied to the Glasgow transport strategy is very much vision-led. So decide and provide is one of the key principles of triple access planning as opposed to predict and provide. We have embraced the 20% car vehicle kilometre reduction target that was set in the National Transport Strategy for Scotland, which again is a good example of vision-led. And we have our own associated target at a local level, which is greater than that, I guess, responding to the fact that we are a large urban area. We've built in the principles of TAP into our policy making, starting from reducing the need to travel, and particularly by vehicles, all the way through to good transport networks and services, which kind of speaks to the physical mobility aspects as well, and all the way to the outcomes of those, such as climate impacts, air quality, and the interrelationships with other areas, such as biodiversity, flood risk management. So I guess I really like in the triple access planning the focus on system-based approach and viewing it, everything in that kind of systems thinking. The point about TAP and looking at external factors and how that may influence demand for travel in the future, we've also incorporated that into our appraisal work for the transport strategy, working with Jacobs. And we've modelled how to achieve the car vehicle kilometre reduction targets that we have, as well as our net zero carbon targets. And we looked at some external factors as to how to test their influence on all of that. And that's told us a lot about where we need to push harder. And some of those areas are absolutely aligned with the triple access planning approach as well, such as trip length reduction. And that really speaks to the spatial proximity piece about planning, land use and services together with transport. Trip avoidance, particularly by vehicles, which again speaks to the digital accessibility aspect of that. Although I think on that we must always emphasise we're not saying people should never travel again. It's looking at specific trips that could potentially be made in a better way for people's quality of life potentially, and even giving them more access by digital accessibility. And that's maybe one of the challenges that we'll talk a little bit more about. But then it's also looked at those other factors, such as traditional physical mobility ones like modal shift and more efficient use of the road network. So I think we have kind of quantitative evidence of how those things can actually help us achieve our targets more essentially. We've also tried to apply scenario planning to our strategy work and identified 3 plausible future scenarios and tested our appraisal interventions against that. I think there's a few challenges with that, certainly in my mind, about how to meaningfully respond to that when you find that some of your interventions don't actually perform very resiliently against some of those external factors in those scenarios. But then again, that responds to another element of TAP, which is that adaptive notion that you monitor and you have to adapt and respond accordingly. And then we've also tried to incorporate thinking on goods, which again is a part of the triple access planning approach, not neglecting that in our transport strategy work. So yeah, we have tried to embrace it, but I think we've still got a way to go, and there's a few challenges and all of that, some of which I've touched on, others may have views on too.
Barbara, thank you very much. And just for my clarity, so when you talk about this either with your colleagues or to your local community, do you frame it specifically in terms of sort of community benefits from adopting this approach? How do you frame this kind of quite technical approach in terms of why it's good for, to your point, the wider sort of community benefits that you might be trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I guess, we started developing the policy framework a few years ago. And to be honest, I was probably just starting to learn about triple access planning at that stage, but starting to get more familiar with some of the things around scenario planning, design and provide, read up on some of the other examples around the globe on that. I probably haven't used the term triple access planning because I do think that's a bit of a transport planning bubble type term. So it's great in this environment, but communicating that to others, probably not so much. I guess I've tried to frame it more when I'm presenting at committee on this or talking to others. It's like a story, it's a narrative, and it has a beginning and an end and a middle almost. So the beginning is, the digital aspect almost of it, as well as the spatial proximity piece. So it's thinking about what are the services, the core concept of accessibility, what are the things that you need access to. And I think the whole 20-minute neighbourhood concept actually really speaks to that and responds well to that. What is it you need access to? How best to access those? Some things would be better done maybe digitally. Others would need physical mobility interventions, but you should be trying to do that spatial proximity thing right at the beginning. So integrating your land use planning and transport. And then when you decide you do need transport, then it's the quality of that, looking at personal security, the price, affordability of it, the availability of services, and then all the way to the end, those outcomes. I kind of think people understand a linear story narrative approach, and that's certainly how I've tried to frame it.
Great, thank you very much. And then finally for this section, Stephen, Deborah's already mentioned the kind of Scottish target on car vehicle kilometre reduction. tell us a bit about your background and how you've been applying this approach at a sort of national devolved administration level in terms of your planning and your policies.
Yeah, interestingly, I'm also been in the industry for about 25 years, 1997. I was late to join the industry, though, which is why I'm so much older looking than Annette and Deborah. So I'm head of appraisal and I'm head of transport model development at Transport Scotland. And yeah, the 20% is one of the areas that really attracted me to looking at triple access planning, when it was sort of like, well, we need to do something differently, because nowhere in the world has ever managed to voluntarily or deliberately reduce traffic. Traffic, if it ever goes down, is usually because there's been an economic crisis. But there is another aspect of this that I think is really important. If you look over Glenn's left shoulder, yeah, his left shoulder, you'll see the full title is Triple Access Planning for Uncertain Futures. And Annette and Rose touched on this as well, in that we're trying to make decisions. So as head of appraisal and modelling, I'm providing both the process and the tools for providing decision makers on the information they need for investment of public money. And that investment can range in transport, can range from small to large, but where large is billions of pounds. So I find decision makers are very, very, very invested in risk. We can't always get rid of it. As we know, well, over 2,000 years ago, Socrates wrote, "To be uncertain is to be uncomfortable, but to be certain is ridiculous." Now, being pedantic, I expect he wrote that in ancient Greek rather than English, but hopefully, I don't think many people would have understood me if I'd read that in ancient Greek. So if it's a ridiculous thing to think we can eliminate the risk of uncertainty, we're going to need to work with it. And whilst we can't eliminate it, we can have a damn good go at managing it and reducing that risk. And for everybody who's involved in transport appraisal, we know that when it comes to investment in transport, the vast majority of the impacts relate to people and getting people to the things that they want to do. And so if we make traveling faster, people can access more things, and that is considered a good thing. So where do we go from there? Well, it's about managing risk. And as Glenn mentioned, the triple access system isn't an artificial concept. It is the world we're actually living in today. And as Rose said, as director, you can imagine that Rose, and she actually did touch on this, you've got a real problem to deliver. So your politicians are coming to the directors or the chief execs of your authorities, national, regional, local, and saying, we have this problem. Like you have a community that has got poor access to employment. As a result, it's got high levels of deprivation, low levels of income, etc. And you go back to that silo working approach. And it's great to hear that Rose is sitting in a directorate with lots of all these things, but you can imagine that old silo working approach where you get your head of transport goes off and goes, actually, do you know what? We need a new railway station in the community that can get people there. And the director of land use goes off and goes, well, we need to attract new businesses to the local authority area, to that area. And the director of digital goes off and goes, we need to get gigabit broadband and training and workups for people. And in this fantasy world that I'm talking about, where the public sector has actually got money, you can imagine that all three of those projects get invested in. And then you do the evaluation, you find that all of them only partially succeeded. And of course, what has happened is that your benefits are being eroded by what everybody else is doing, or you can look at it the other way around and say, well, actually, we've double or triple invested for all trying to grab the same set of benefits. So for my work, it's about trying to kind of make sure we are de-risking all those aspects. So when somebody comes forward with a business case, you have not treated the other two paradigms as exogenous externals. We don't know what's happening. You're thinking about it all in the rounds and bringing it all together in your investment case or your business case. And then I'll just very finally touch on, as you say, I did joke about whether or not the Transport Planning Society should become the Triple Access Planning Society. The service that we provide in Transport Scotland is called Land Use and Transport Integration in Scotland, Lattice. It's been called that for the last 15 years. But of course, it's missing one aspect. So I am now proposing the idea to my managers that we change Lattice to TAPIS and become the Triple Access Planning in Scotland service.
We should commission some branding from the same agency, I think. So Stephen, fascinating. Thank you very much. So you mentioned sort of, and as have others, this kind of problem about silos. To what extent is this approach allowing you to at least present potential investment decisions in a way that optimizes between different, otherwise siloed options? I mean, is it, in practice, how useful is it proving?
We're not there yet. This
Okay.
is, I mean, one of those kind of like, we need to think about how we do this. So I was pleased for the Triple Access project. I did bring in colleagues from the Planning Directorate and from the Digital Directorate into trying to help us frame all of this. So we have at least got those three aspects of the organisation talking to each other. And we are already starting to present information to directors and ministers in this kind of triple access place, with a view to then where do we go from here. At the moment, I'm responsible for STAG, Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance. I'm also responsible for development planning and management transport appraisal guidance, which is the kind of land use bit. One of my former colleagues, he's just written digital appraisal something Scotland, I can't remember what, guidance for Scotland. So it's how do we start making sure we're looking across all of those three bits of independent thinking and go, right, actually we need to start a way of thinking how we improve and possibly even consolidate them. There is a challenge if you consolidate them, we just end up with something like the Green Book. But it's somewhere between the two is where I'm kind of thinking we need to go. And then also starting to do more research. So last year we had AECOM do some work on people, population and household location choice in Scotland, considering all three dimensions to it. And what kind of further research can we do in that space to try and start bringing all these together to try and tackle some of the significant problems that we have.
Great, thank you very much. So I'd like to sort of start the next round of questions around the politics of this, if that doesn't seem like too big a thing to throw at you. So there's been a lot of debate in the last 6, 12, 18 months around low traffic neighbourhoods, around 50-minute cities or 50-minute communities, around the Welsh speed limit targets. So some of these sort of initiatives that might be sort of driven by triple access planning are proving quite challenging politically. Deborah, from your point of view, from a sort of city council perspective, how are you finding the big and small p politics of this approach, and how are you dealing with any issues that arise? For example, people say, oh, well, you're going to constrain me in my neighbourhood and geo-fence me so I can't go to the pub. I mean, is it coming up politically, and if so, how are you dealing with that?
Well, we have a programme of livable neighbourhoods, which is part of our response to the 20-minute neighbourhoods concept, and we're working closely with our planners on that. But yes, the politics of it, I suppose I alluded to that a little bit in my intro. I think it's really easy when you talk about digital accessibility, which is different from digital connectivity, and that's a key point to note, and maybe something that'd be interesting to talk about at some point. But you know, when we talk about that, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're suggesting to people that they don't travel again and that they stay at home and they access everything online, which is sometimes where people's minds go. I think it's human nature. People tend to think in quite black and white terms sometimes. And a lot of this, I think, is quite nuanced and grey and kind of in the middle. It's the same with the whole sort of sustainable transport thing. And again, it's something we say a lot. No one is saying that you can never use your car again. That's not what we're saying. We're trying to encourage and reshape and rebalance a society that's possibly just been designed a bit too much for the car at the expense of lots of other outcomes, essentially. So I guess, politically, it's to look at the digital accessibility aspect of it, and digital connectivity can actually have benefits, commercially. And I think some of the work that Glenn and others have been working on is actually really useful in that regard. It can be a good thing. So if you think about the city centres, yes, have taken a wee bit of a beating during COVID lockdowns and post, and there's a lot of emphasis on getting people back into city centres, which is absolutely the case in Glasgow as well. And there's nothing really wrong with that, particularly in terms of the nighttime economy. That's something we absolutely need to boost. There's an experience there that you need physical mobility, and you probably want those physical mobility options to be able to access physically the city centre. But the digital aspect of that can actually enhance that experience. It can give you information before you leave the house and help you plan things a bit better, promote businesses as well. It can also help you plan your journey better as well. And so that there's something around that. I think it goes back to what Glenn was saying right at the beginning, that this is a planning tool. It's a way to help you look first and foremost at what it is that you're wanting access to and what you want to achieve. And I think fundamentally it's about the objectives. What are the objectives that you're trying to reach? If your objectives are about trying to support city centre vibrancy, then you think about all those three dimensions, and there'll be various solutions. And it will vary. It'll be vary by area, it'll vary by topic.
Thank you, Rose. The same question to you. You're also at the kind of political coalface, no doubt wrestling with some of these kind of framing and challenges around what the intention is. How is this playing out politically? Sounds like it's working internally well, but in terms of the kind of politics of community involvement, how's it working in your area?
Did I come across it? It's working well. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Great. That's absolutely what I want people to think. No, it's very collaborative and really ambitious, brilliant council to work within, and everyone's sort of on board with this conversation, and our chief exec is absolutely about a one council approach. So that's her huge mantra. It's absolutely threaded through everything. It's all about breaking silos down, because you can't have an amazing local transport plan and then a brilliant borough plan and then a great homelessness plan and they're not talking to each other. And again, that kind of this engenders that discussion. But you asked politically. It's really interesting. We're about to go. There's a local election cycle coming up, which dips you back into a pre-election period, or PERDA as it was used to be known. And then you come into a general election cycle, and that again tips you back into this pre-election period. And during those periods of time, you can't consult, you can't do anything that's got a political frame to it. And what we're doing is actually stalling the things like, or thinking very, very cleverly and clearly about when we launch what, because we know instantly it will be picked up and used as a political football. So, for example, our climate action plan, our climate emergency plan, we're going to, maybe stall the consultation and think differently about what we do so that it doesn't fall into a political cycle where it can be picked apart and used and just, decimated in terms of what it's there to do and what it's there to achieve, because it will be picked apart politically, and all of these funny bumps that we've seen recently will come back up again. It's the same with the local transport plan. We are brave, ambitious. We know we need and want to do so much more from a transport connectivity and an actual transport network approach. But we sat for hours thinking about how to frame what and how and our language. And did it stifle? You know what, potentially I think it did. Were we as brave? Well, maybe we probably weren't. But actually, what we're doing is making sure that externally, we're not saying anything that sort of inflames or lights touch papers that will just throw apart any useful, meaningful conversation. But actually behind the scenes, what we're doing is looking at policy, being progressive. But what's been absolutely critical for us, Ben, is engaging with the widest possible audience that we possibly can and giving equal voice to our community inspirers, who are groups who've got lived experience of poverty and really sort of difficult circumstances. We're giving absolute credibility and credence to the voice of young people. We're absolutely giving credibility to those hard to reach, marginalised groups who we don't hear from enough. So actually what we're trying to do is be aware of that, the political soundings that you get, but actually consult brilliantly and consult clearly, equitably, and with massive parity, making sure that all of those groups that want to be heard can be heard. And actually that starts to balance the picture. And actually that starts to help you have that more balanced conversation. And I was in a session yesterday with colleagues from Transport for the North talking about our Tackling Social Exclusion report that was done by TfN, Tackling Social Exclusion with transport, basically. And I think that they do one of the best articulations of why triple access planning matters, because actually you centre everything back to giving everybody equal opportunity. And it's a brilliant place to keep pulling yourself back to. Now, I may have skirted around a few issues, Ben, and I might not have been as pithy as you might have wanted me to be in this space. I have to talk quite around the subject matter sometimes, just in light of what of where we are and where we are in a political cycle too. But actually, our focus is constantly on marginalised, hard to get to, hard to reach people we don't hear from. And actually, if we centre everything on that, then we start to get the right outcomes. And there's some brilliant work been done about it recently. And I think triple access planning is absolutely at the root of all of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to this, but I think what I'm hearing is a very clear message from all of you about the value and power of this approach in terms of connecting it to the much broader policy, social and political agenda. Yeah.
I should have said outcomes. That's exactly that is exactly outcome focused, not cost, not put this in, get that out. What is the outcome? And a brilliant bus franchising. What a fantastic way to talk about outcomes as opposed to cost, because that is much more about the social connectivity and the brilliance of connecting people, more so than it is about running a bus service and price per mile. It's absolutely about all of those things. So sorry.
No, it's great. And what was interesting, I was at an event last week where Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, was talking very much in terms of transport as a means of unlocking all these much broader social and economic goals. And I think this approach obviously helps with that approach. Moving on to a slightly different question around sort of data and analytical tools. There's a question in the chat from Roger Witter saying, and again, you've answered, but perhaps if you can answer it for the broader audience. What are the data gaps, if any, around triple access planning, and what can we do to make sure we've got the right data in place? And then relatedly, how do we make sure we've got the right sort of tools to ensure this is an evidence-based approach rather than just a kind of theoretical policy approach? Graham, what's your sort of sense, having been involved in this for a while, of where the data gaps might be and how to make sure this is analytically robust? And then Stephen, I might come to you with the same question, given your role.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, Roger, as well. Yeah, quite a bundle of issues there. And as I said at the end of my introductory remarks, but this isn't proposed as a quick fix, easy solution to the intractably difficult challenges we face. I guess without sounding too glib, I'd say if we ask how good we've been with data for the last 100 years, even the last 20, we've been pretty crap. We've seen a comment from Michael about neurodivergence. I think if you ask people who have anxiety, if you ask women who are worried about walking in unlit streets at night, there's a whole host of protected characteristics and diversity reflected in society that middle-aged white men, like myself at least, characterising the transport planning profession have simply been ignorant of. So in a sense, the starting point for asking what data do we need is a pretty poor one, I would suggest. And therefore, it's not as if we can do much worse to begin with. The other challenge has been that if we go right back to the 1998 white paper and the 10-year plan of 2000, gosh, in the last century, as Annette would say, one of the quotes within those documents was, the internet and its usage may change and impact transport profoundly and needs to be monitored closely. Well, we didn't do that, did we? There's a bit of data here and there from ONS, but there's not really a serious attention being placed, or hasn't been placed in transport at least, to making sense of the fundamentals of a derived demand like transport. So it's not a case, I think, Roger or Ben is saying there's a gap here. If we can just fill that, things will be fine. We've also got a comment about from Derek Haldon. I assume that's the Derek on the call, referring to John Barrington, about the slippery bar of soap that is access or accessibility. And one of our challenges is if we try and pin this down in the way our classic mindset in transport planning has been that we want to be able to identify, define and measure, we are going to get caught up and tied up in knots. And part of this is about an intense sense of pragmatism. I'm not arguing away the importance of data, but evidence is not the same as truth when you're looking at the future. And what I would say at the moment is we've got an appalling representation of false precision. Everywhere I look in transport, every time I go on LinkedIn, somebody is telling me to the nearest 2 or 3 decimal places what's going to happen in 15, 20 or 30 years' time. We're deluding ourselves. So the idea that data is standing in the way, I'm inclined to say is claptrap to a point. I appreciate that's been a rather glib and slightly evasive answer, Ben. So maybe Stephen can help with a second salvo.
Well,
Stephen, your job essentially, yeah. So where are you, Stephen, on the kind of data? And to Gen's point, is this actually is looking for the data foundation of this actually looking in the wrong place? Should we be starting within the kind of analytical intent and then working out how to get the best results for society more broadly?
Oh, gold. Yeah, I think, as Glenn said, this is the start of in a sense, we've been on this 3-year project there, and it is coming to the end, but it's the end of the beginning, I think is the term. And it's now, how do we go forward? You think about it, we were building canals, railways, roads. The Romans were doing this. I don't think they had the exact levels of benefit cost ratios that we have and are generally expected nowadays. We, as humans, we are perfectly capable, I think, of looking at things and taking a step back and going, okay, there's a bigger picture here. We need to be pragmatic and we need to see where we go. If you wait for the precise levels of analytical thing that we've had for the last 20, 30 years in transport, then we'll probably just keep doing everything wrong. I think decision makers would not be happy with us doing that. So to me, the challenge is there. We've got to get on and move forward. Is there a data gap? I don't think we even actually, in a sense, sometimes have the data to even start on this in some ways. How do we measure access? We have to, I don't know, I tend to find people get very hung up on trying to come up with a number. It's like saying, oh, my access is 27, your access is 36. Rather than taking, again, that step back and going, well, what do individuals need? Because access across the 3 dimensions will be very different for every single person, for every single place. So those are real challenges. And indeed, how does one even start to measure digital access? In transport, we are quite fixated on travel diaries, whereas actually we should probably be looking at time use diaries. I have barely traveled today, and yet I have been all over the place in different calls to places with people all over the place. That is a form of access that, how do you measure? And it ultimately always comes back to utility. And when you speak to economists, measuring utility is exceedingly difficult. So we tend to measure lots of proxies for it. It's fine if that proxy is in one simple dimension. When it moves across different dimensions, it becomes really difficult. So we've got a long way to go in how we do the analytics of this. I don't think it stops us necessarily. Once you've kind of decided that, well, maybe we've looked across the piece, we've thought about the digital, we've thought about language, thought about transport, and we still want to go up ahead and do this new railway. The tools we have are so great for doing the new railway. This is, I think, a bit more about thinking higher up, and what Rose said there about the outcomes and impacts of what we do. It's about trying to raise the questions we're doing to that. I spend a lot of time talking about transport planning objectives at projects in Scotland, and the argument is always about trying to get people to lift their vision up. So rather than kind of like, how do we make this bus faster? It's sort of like, well, yeah, but how's this changing the community? That's what's important, not whether the bus is faster, because you might be able to deliver that same outcome to the community in a different way. That's got nothing to do with the bus. I don't know, but we need to be thinking that broader spectrum.
Great, thanks. And Annette, on this question again, so you're working with public sector clients who obviously need to put things through committees and demonstrate that what they're proposing to do is kind of robust. To what extent are you being asked to provide data points, or are you sort of saying, well, actually we don't have the precision we have elsewhere? To Glenn's point is false anyway, so let's go with what we know.
I think so. We've taken the route of starting somewhere, and we found that's really important to actually start somewhere, and then we know there are data gaps, but they can be improved, and once we've kind of trialed some use of data, we can know where we might need to go and find different sources of data, or where we might be able to collect new data. So what we've done is we've created a map that enables us to look at how many facilities people can access by walking and cycling within sort of like 10 minutes. How far can people get on public transport in 45 minutes from within a a 0.5 mile kind of hexagon on a map. And interestingly, in terms of digital, when we put the digital layer on, so we've mapped spatial in terms of walking and cycling, and we've mapped physical in terms of this 45-minute public transport. When we went to digital, the map that we found in terms of digital accessibility was actually flat. It didn't give us enough aggregation. So how we went on from there is that we actually started looking at internet usage and thinking about who lives where and who uses digital. And actually that also starts to show where there might be people that need additional training. And that's obviously really important in terms of triple access planning and in terms of helping people to access digital if they want to. I think what was interesting is that, like I say, we've started somewhere, and it's actually proven to be good enough for now. And so we, the maps that we can create, what we did when we first rolled them out to kind of local authority offices is that they recognised their areas. So going back to kind of Rose's point about social outcomes and people who are marginalised, we were able to identify 4 different types of areas across the West Midlands, and one of them was isolated with limited choices, which basically meant that the people that lived in those areas had low accessibility in terms of triple access, but they also had low car use. So they kind of lived in sort of amenity deserts. They had really poor accessibility in terms of public transport, but also that correlated with the fact that those officers knew that those areas were where people lived who were marginalised. So it comes back to that point of, we know we've got data gaps, but we can already use data that we've got to good effect to support decision making and these social outcomes that we want to achieve.
Great, thank you very much. Really helpful. So we've touched on the fact that we've been trying for a while to integrate land use planning and transport planning, and now we're trying to add the digital dimension as well, which sort of potentially both helps with that, but also makes it more complicated. Deborah, you mentioned earlier the distinction between digital connectivity and digital accessibility. And we've just been hearing a bit more about the kind of digital dimensions. Tell us a bit more about that. Why is that distinction important, and how are you dealing with that in your thinking about this in Glasgow?
Well, I think the point is we're probably not thinking about it enough at the moment, because there is still, it's hard to get our heads around digital accessibility as opposed to digital connectivity. So I've been having some discussions with colleagues about this, and I guess whenever you talk about digital, people's minds automatically does go to whether you have access to broadband, what the actual digital networks and the quality of those networks are in a particular area. But I think, and I'm still learning about this, and Glenn would be able to talk to it with more authority, but I understand that more to be about the digital connectivity piece. The digital accessibility bit is different. That's almost thinking about what are the services and facilities that you need access to, and then who can access that, how can they access it? That's really tricky, and that speaks to some of the points that Stephen was saying there, and I think Glenn was also saying that you start to get tied up in knots almost if you start to try and define that. But in a sense, it is an important aspect of it, I think. But it feels to me a gargantuan task because it's so disaggregated, and also the public sector, as local authorities, we don't have control over that. We can't control whether GP services, as far as I know, we can't control if medical appointments are offered digitally, for example. But obviously offering that to some people who might benefit from that feels like a good thing, and then that would have a knock-on impact on the physical mobility. And I think the last point I would make about this is that one of the really knotty problems that I have with TAP, and I love it, I think it's all great, but it's how do we actually analytically take account of that digital accessibility in assessing travel demand, so the need for the physical mobility options. You know, we have taken that into account. Our consultants, Jacobs, did incorporate an external factor, you know, a number basically in our modelling for reduced trip making, and we applied that to our modelling. But was it scientific? I don't know. And it feels to me that there is still an analytical gap there in really understanding what impact that digital accessibility will have on the travel demand. And that matters because, you know, our appraisal systems and our business case systems really take into account travel demand. So it feels like it is a systematic thing. You know, we do have to consider that. And if we don't want to scientifically think about that, then almost we have to change how we do appraisal and business cases for schemes.
Great. Glenn, clearly there's a whole kind of world of people thinking about digital connectivity and accessibility. As you've been evolving this idea, how have you sought to kind of bring them into this conversation and get a more refined understanding of what digital accessibility really means, you know, on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Deborah said. To me, digital connectivity is necessary but not sufficient. In other words, if I said to you, there we are, we put a road outside your house, you can now gain employment, you can live a full, happy life and feel part of society. Of course, you'd say, well, how do I use it? You say, well, you need a car. Haven't you got one? We can go and buy one. Well, I don't know how to drive. What do you mean you don't know how to drive? Well, should we have to give you driving lessons? Well, I can't afford a car. Oh, okay, well, perhaps you'll have to share one. And, well, I've got my car now. I've taken my lessons. I've driven to the end of this road and there's nothing there. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, we better put something in then. We'll put some shops in. Well, I can't get into the shop. The prices are too expensive. So, of course, we know all this from the way we've lived in the world of transport planning, that, you know, it's not just the infrastructure. It's a much deeper understanding of transport and society and about how people live their lives. I see Tim Gent mentioned, you know, the National Travel Survey, for example, at least as a way of reminding us that we've got different journey purposes. So, you know, I think in that sense, it is absolutely about digital accessibility rather than only digital connectivity. The other point I'd make in terms of science or guesswork, perhaps, I know you didn't quite say this, Deborah, in a sense, and I'm not kind of downplaying modelling here, because we need to use these tools in the best way we can, but really what we've been using models for are what-if scenarios for quite a long time. We've labelled them forecasts, and we've even had the gall to label some of them reference cases or most likely futures, but we know the outturn results are nothing like that. So why should we worry suddenly that we can't accurately understand what's going to happen when we press something here and what pops up somewhere else? And I think it's about exploring with our modelling tools the what ifs, the what could happen. And another aspect of that is, of course, in supply-led demand terms, we're not trying to forecast what's going to happen in this triple access world. We're saying, how might we want to shape it? And, you know, the reality is triple access is changing all the time. Government and planners can be hands-off. It's going to carry on changing anyway. You know, house builders are going to put properties in locations. Amazons are going to come along, and that change is ongoing. The question is, how much governance and intervention do we want to have in terms of the public sector shaping that for the better? And it's partly explorative, and, you know, it does need to be adaptive in its thinking because things are very uncertain. I think the joke is, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, we'd be so excited there was this thing called video conferencing, and hardly anyone would be on it because most people would have a 56k modem. We've now got connectivity that's 19,000 times faster than a quarter of a century ago. Where the hell are we going to be in 20 years' time? We're not going to be sat on a clunky Zoom call wondering why some of the connection problems were there. Goodness knows what will have happened by then. So the idea that we are stopped by data about the future, I think, is an anathema, and it maybe, as Deborah says, points to quite fundamental rethink philosophically again about how we approach the planning task. And of course, that's why it's evolutionary and not revolutionary, because we can't expect the best will in the world, the appraisal system to sort of roll over and say, go on, have a go at whatever you fancy, because public funds are being invested and there has to be an accountability.
Great. And then Rose, similar question to you in terms of colleagues in your local authority thinking about digital connectivity or the lack of it. Annette mentioned sort of personas for communities who are disconnected in a variety of ways. How are you kind of weaving in the digital connectivity and accessibility strand to this in terms of your planning and your investments?
Yeah, it all comes under the Place Directorate. So we're actually kind of looking at this at the moment. So it's a very live topic and a live conversation. So Place is all about, well, you'd have expected sort of built environment, really, wouldn't you? So, regeneration frameworks and attracting outward investment and connectivity and all these master plans and all that good stuff. But actually, digital has come in and all of a sudden sort of taken over vast numbers of staff, and it's sort of a huge sort of endeavour on its own now. We have people who are involved with skills, so they look after businesses. We've got vast kind of skill deserts, so to speak. So we've got huge, amazing industrial clusters who are trying to rapidly decarbonise, so SRs and sort of those groups. So we've got a very real problem in terms of connecting people to places currently. But we've also got a huge digital desert too, but it's mostly from a rural perspective. But unfortunately, as with everything, it's about speed. It's about digital connectivity from a speed perspective. It's not that outcome focused. It's not looking at why we want to look at those places and when we want to look at them in what order and why. It's just sort of like, what's the average speed? What's the average connection? Who's got what? So we've got, for me, digital connectivity actually is a rural issue as well. It's actually almost a physical issue too, because urban, fine, we're almost kind of where we would want to be or where we're told to be by the government from a connectivity perspective, but actually not so from a rural perspective. And so there's a really interesting, even though digital is not physical, actually there is quite a physical divide around those kind of constructs about where people are and what they're trying to do. But actually rural is where you need it most, because that's where you've often got the lack of transport options and the lack of, options in terms of services as well. So I think there's a real physical conversation to be had behind the digital debate and digital conversation. And I know it's where a lot of my colleagues who are sort of looking after this are sat at the moment trying to kind of figure it out. I mean, digital, for me, this conversation, it's about equity. It's always about equity. And I come back to that point that I sort of made in my introductory comments about housing and social housing and where we put people and then expect them to thrive, and they don't, because we don't connect them digitally. We don't put them in the right place so they're connected socially, and we don't put them in the right place so they're connected physically. And actually, all through this conversation, Ben, I've been wanting to bring in points about sort of NHS and partner organisations as well, and what we're doing and how that underpins it. And that digital conversation from a doctor's appointment, no, we don't have the levers. But my goodness me, are we trying to absolutely think about the best outcomes from an NHS perspective in everything we do? Because the people we're talking about represent themselves in a circular door to the NHS if we don't get our triple access right. If they're not in the right place with the right services and that right connectivity, then they present themselves back in from an NHS context with additional burden, financial burden, and all of that emotional burden that they've got from a societal and also a local authority perspective. This, for me, is on every level, on every decision making, whether it be digital, physical, or service or connectivity. It's got a part to play in all of it, but we actually do have a really interesting physical divide between that digital connectivity as well.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm conscious of time, but I just want to pick up freight and logistics, which a couple of you have touched on, and then I'm going to come to you to say a bit more about your forthcoming handbook, practitioner's handbook. Deborah, you mentioned freight and logistics in your opening remarks. Tell us a bit more about how you're factoring in the sort of triple access planning aspect of freight and logistics as opposed to personal travel, and how successful that's being.
So we have tried to apply thinking around the movement of goods to the development of our transport strategy, because I think, as the forthcoming handbook potentially highlights, the movement of goods does sometimes get forgotten about a little in transport strategies, which does tend to focus more on people trips. But I guess the triple access planning concept, it's about how interrelated it all is. And in our work, we started to look at, when we were starting to think way back about scenarios and those external factors that may influence travel demand in the future. One of those was around online shopping, for example, and changes in the movement of goods, maybe more disaggregated, the use of last mile delivery and the use of delivery hubs, and even sort of what's the word, micro delivery options, essentially, where you have in-post boxes in your supermarket, which I'll be honest, I use a lot. So that whole landscape is changing, and that is really linked to the wider aspects of transport planning. So again, we tried to look at that way back in the beginning in terms of our external factors and scenario planning, and then we tested our packages and our interventions in our strategy process against 3 scenarios that we came up with. And some of those scenarios did take that into account to an extent and tried to look at the impact that that would have on a number of indicators such as trip length, demand for travel, all of those kind of things. Then I guess going back to the transport strategy, the policy framework in Glasgow being a bit of a narrative, a bit of a story, we do have a section in it where we have tried to think about the movement of goods as well. And then in our spatial delivery framework, we've also tried to look at some of those spatial characteristics or criteria that we would look to see around freight consolidation, for example, around last mile delivery hubs. But I guess the challenge always for me in that is what can the public sector actually do on that? Can we be an enabler? Can we provide vacant land, for example, storage facilities? These are some of the things that the goods industry is looking for. Can we enhance our GIS systems and open data to make that information more available? So that's always a bit of a challenge. I think we've tried to incorporate into our policy thinking, but could we do more? Definitely. But I would say that we have tried to get the message across in our transport strategy that goods is an absolutely vital part of any city, of anywhere, and we absolutely can't ignore it.
Thank you. Annette, same question to you. When you're working, for example, with TfWM or other local authority clients, to what extent are they asking you to think about freight logistics alongside personal travel, and how easy is it to incorporate in this approach when you are asked that question?
It's definitely a useful tool to be able to think through this lens for freight and logistics. I think that, to be honest, freight does tend to be that forgotten kind of aspect. So it's about us, I think, as transport professionals being intentional about saying, you know, let's not forget about freight and logistics. There is that additional kind of challenge around freight operators and how, you know, the kind of private sector ownership of and you know, then the issues with kind of developing land in that respect. But personally, I think that, you know, the triple access planning model provides us with an excellent framework for freight just as much as it does for personal travel as well. But we just need to be intentional about remembering to covering that so that we're holistic.
Great, thank you. And then Stephen, the same question for you. When you're thinking about this from a Scottish perspective, where is freight and logistics in your thinking, and how are you including that in your sort of in your decision making, support for decision makers?
Yeah, as Annette says, freight obviously poor cousin so often in our thinking on all this. And just a brief shout out to DFT. I'm interested in the FAME work, freight analysis modeling environment, at least to try and start improving where around our thinking on all of this. But as others said, it's about using the reality of the world, which is triple access, to look at all these problems, whatever they're in, whether it's freight and logistics or anything else. The reality is that all 3 of them are affecting all of these sectors, all of these systems, and we have to really get our heads around it and start thinking about it. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So Glenn, you've been thinking and writing and talking about this for a decade. Clearly, triple access planning is both a sort of concept, but also a practice. We know that you've got your practitioner's handbook coming out shortly. Tell us a bit more about that and how we might utilize that, for example, in thinking about local transport planning guidance or indeed the practice of local transport and access planning on the ground in local communities.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. A bit of a plug, and I appreciate it. So we've had, as various people have referred to, a 3-year project, pan-European. It's practitioner focused, although it does involve academics. Health warning there. There've been 16 partners in 5 countries. So this is, already casting the net quite widely to understand how this applies across Europe, not just in particular locations. Our big challenge has been, of course, to try and make triple access as accessible as a planning approach as it can be. And I think what this conversation today has demonstrated is, on the one hand, it's a no-brainer that it makes sense, but on the other hand, what a complex world we live in, and how on earth do we deal with all of this unless we just pretend and ignore the difficulties? So a health warning, we have been preparing a handbook. It's going to be launched on the 18th of March, a handbook for practitioners. It's running at about 120 pages as I do the final checks on it from an amazing set of people inputting to it. But, if we dumbed it down to 30 pages, you'd realise from this conversation that simply wouldn't be enough. So we have made an 8-page summary report for you just as an entree to proceedings. But what we try to do within there is take you through, if you get into reading it, a journey through the different stages or phases of a planning process. We've introduced a new phase 0, which is philosophy. And I hope it's become apparent from today that really matters in practical terms, how we think before we plan and act. And then we go into preparation, analysis, strategy development, and measure planning. And for each of those phases of the planning process, we introduce you to as much as we've learnt from case studies and from our own work around the philosophy, around the triple access perspective we can take on our planning approach, around uncertainty, which perhaps we've talked a little bit less about today, but uncertainty and how we handle it is another key dimension of triple access planning. And last, but by no means least, is access for goods. So this is not just a kind of any other business remark at the end of the handbook, it's integral to the handbook. The final wraparound, I suppose, for the handbook is we talk about organisational and institutional issues. And I know, the many practitioners on the panel on the call deal with this day in, day out. There are formal organisations, there are formal institutions in how we do planning, but there's also soft power and informal networks and ways in which we can operate more smartly within the systems that we exist within. So we've tried as best we can to lay all that out, Ben, for you and others in as an accessible way as possible, and hopefully a way that invites people in to become part of this movement, which I really hope it will continue to be, and we need more of it, it seems to me, in the times we're in.
And just a very practical question, Glenn, if people want to have a look at this document once it's published, where will it be? How will they get access to it, to use that phrase?
It will be freely available online. The QR codes swirling around the internet, and we'll be promoting it through various articles and mail outs to people. So I'm hoping we've not left many stones unturned in terms of communication, which of course communication is always the thing we're not so good at. So
or you could all travel to a bookshop and buy a physical copy, no doubt. Or maybe not. So look, we're nearly at time. I'm conscious there's a whole lot of questions in the chat that we haven't been able to come to, so my apologies for that. I'd like to finish by asking each of you, if I could, the tricky question to ask you at this point in the proceedings. What's the one thing you would say that it's important about triple access planning, so that we can go away with that thought in our minds as we rush to a bookshop or a website to get a copy of Glenn's handbook when it comes out in a couple of weeks? Annette, I'm going to start with you. What's the one thing you think we should know or think about triple access planning as we think about an uncertain future?
I do think, Glenn's point about communication, I would love to be able to communicate and educate people about triple access planning right the way through down to the individual level. And I say this because I was sat in a geography module sort of like back in, I don't know, ages, and my professor talked about like where people live, where they choose to live will affect how they, will affect their lifestyle. And like, all these years on, I'm thinking, gosh, triple access, that's what he was kind of talking about. And actually, can we get sort of education and communication out to citizens about this stuff? I think they would really appreciate the kind of communication around it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Rose, same question to you. What's the one thing we should take away thinking about triple access planning, how it might help us in an uncertain world?
It'll allow us to make a balanced decision that's outcome focused. It isn't predicated just on looking at business case related fiscal value. This is about societal support, societal change, and supporting everybody through making really good decision making. So I think absolutely outcome focused and a balanced approach to that conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Deborah, from a Glasgow point of view, what's the one thing you'd want your local community or your politicians to know about triple access planning?
I think the core concept of accessibility, and I take the point in the chat that accessibility planning has been around for a while, but that for me, and building on what Rose said earlier in the call about equity, is absolutely about what we need access to live, lives of quality, of fairness, that are equitable opportunities. And arguably, if you think about it in that way, much of what has happened over the last few decades hasn't really been with that in mind, because it has only provided primarily access for people with a specific mode of transport, and that's what we're now trying to fix. So if you think about that core equity of access to what we need as a society, I think that's core to it.
Brilliant, thank you. Stephen, from a Scottish Government point of view, what's one thing you'd want us to take away from your thinking about this?
The triple access system is reality. This is the world we actually live in. Yes, it'll be difficult to do some of the analytics, but it's actually quite straightforward to feed this into documents in various different ways. So I have already, it's not explicitly it's called triple access planning, as Deborah said earlier, that's a geeky terminology, but it's already there in our national transport strategy. It's already there in our delivery plan. It's there in our 20% behaviour change plan. It's there in our local transport strategy guidance now. It is quite straightforward in a sense, just to weave it in and say, remember this, look at this, and just do it.
Great, thank you very much. So this is not
hoping Nike won't charge me for that.
And Glenn, we started with you. You started all this. What's the one thing you'd want us to take away from your deliberations about this topic over a decade or more?
I think if it doesn't sound too glib, Ben, I'd say we all know that failing to plan is planning to fail. I think I've learned the hard lesson that failing to think before you plan could also be planning to fail. And the foundation to everything we do in planning is the perspective we take, or the lens that Rose referred to. That lens is not a singular lens. We're all different. We need that diversity that's been mentioned today to be brought into the way we think together. It's a collaborative undertaking. It's about convening a diversity of views to tackle these wicked problems.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much indeed. So I've heard a number of really interesting things. This is a new way of thinking, but it's a way of thinking about the world as it actually is. It's an uncertain world. It's really important how we frame these issues and communicate them to a variety of different audiences and stakeholders. To Rose's point, is a critical way of joining up across a whole number of public policy and delivery domains to try and get the best out of the finite resources that we have to use. We have to tie this back to social, economic and environmental outcomes. It's not just a kind of input thing, it's an outcome thing. I was struck by this thing about don't get too hung up on false data precision. As Stephen said, the Romans didn't do a whole lot of BCR calculations before they built the Fossway, did they? And that didn't hurt them too badly. I'm intrigued by this question around thinking about what digital accessibility really means and how you characterize it, even if you can't quantify it in currently any kind of reliable way. Don't forget freight and logistics, and above all, recognize that this is an approach to an uncertain world that is only likely to get more uncertain over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Thank you all very much indeed for your participation. Glenn, thank you very much for starting off this whole process. Thanks to Stephen, Annette, Deborah, Rose, and thank you very much to the whole audience for coming and for all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get through all of those. Look out for Glenn's publication, the handbook, on the 18th of March, and maybe we'll come back in a few months, Glenn, once people had a chance to look at it and have another conversation about this. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed for your contributions and for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for brilliantly chairing today. And thank you very much, Shania.
Oh, thank you, Shani. Yes, I do beg your pardon, especially for sorting out the technical glitch. Quite right, Glenn. My apologies.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being flexible with the technology.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.